day, everyone. We have now 11 o'clock where I live, and I hope you all had a nice coffee break and digested the input from the first half of the session. And to the newcomers here, if there's anyone in this session who was not in the first session, welcome to you. And we are happy to present more from our SMARTEES project in the next 90 minutes. So I will not make much ado here in the start. You have already some understanding of what we did from the first half, and now we continue with one more presentation that will give you some taste of the cases and of the work that we did in analyzing the cases, but this time with a particular focus on energy justice questions. And then afterwards, we will dive into the social simulation. So to start with the first presentation, Giuseppe will take over from here.
Morning, everyone. I'm going to talk today about drivers and barriers to energy social innovations in neighborhoods and how this can impact on a just transitions and what policies we need for a just transition. So moving forward, well, what is, first of all, a just transition? A just transition has been defined as a fair and equitable process of moving towards a post-carbon society. And with this definition, which is of course quite generic, there is a specific reference to justice theory. In recent years, there has been a fast-growing bulk of literature regarding environmental justice and energy justice. Particularly energy justice has been defined by three pillars, one of distributional justice, the other one of procedural justice, and the third one of recognition justice. With the first, distributional justice, clearly we refer to a fairer distribution of goods in society. With procedural justice, more inclusive processes that can account for the right of everyone to contribute to policy making and decision making. And with the recognition justice, the importance of recognizing the rights of those that are more disadvantaged, marginalized groups, essentially. We think that there are four main challenges standing on the way towards a just transition, and we have defined them in a paper that we published recently as the first one, the intergenerational justice problem. So the way that we will achieve a transition today will affect also future generations. So we will have to be mindful about the type of transitions that we put in place. Secondly, a justice and energy vulnerability issue. So how is going the transition to affect vulnerable groups? There is the risk that the transition might widen the social gaps in our society if we don't do it in the right way. Thirdly, how is going the transition to affect the transformation of the social imaginary due to the new energy infrastructure that will be placed on our landscapes? So our cities and even more possibly our countryside will change. How is this going to impact the way that we perceive our environment and the way we live it? We need to be mindful of this aspect as well, considering that in the past, often new energy infrastructure has been placed in disadvantaged communities, therefore making even worse the environmental justice issues locally. And fourthly, can we compensate for the damages created by energy infrastructure? Clearly, today we are going to focus on energy vulnerability because this is the closest theme that we have with the cases that I'm going to talk with. So energy vulnerability has been defined as the propensity of an individual to become incapable of securing a materially and a socially needed level of energy service in the home. And this is quite relevant, as I said, because we are going to talk about social innovations in neighborhoods. Social innovations have been already defined in previous presentations, but clearly, just to remind you very quickly, we are not going to look at only energy or technical interventions, but we look at a wider process that include relationships, interactions, sharing of knowledge. So social innovations have the ambitions not only to affect the energy side, but also the social side, as the word, of course, social innovation implies. So let's look at the cases that we have in the SMARTEES project regarding particularly neighborhoods. They are placed in the context of a research that has already illustrated in previous presentations, along with the cases regarding mobility and islands. But we are going to focus on specifically the cases of Malmö and Stockholm, of urban regeneration, and the cases of Aberdeen and Timisoara, which are aimed at tackling more specifically fuel poverty. But as we can see from the description of all these cases, actually, there are many commonalities, and particularly the fact that these cases were placed in neighborhoods that showed signs of social deprivation. For example, the case of Järva in Stockholm, which is a peripheral neighborhood where up to 30% of people were in unemployment. It was relatively old for the context of Stockholm, a building stock which was built in the period between 1965 and 1980 to host social housing, which is also the case for Malmö, which also was mainly developed as social housing estate. To this date, in Järva, we have a large proportion of immigrants living there. About 80% of the people living in the neighborhoods are immigrants. And this clearly has presented several challenges of communication and involvement of the local population. And there is a large number of apartments to give you an idea of the type of urban environment that we are looking at. Similarly, in Malmö, we have a large number of apartments, and we have a large number of immigrants living in the neighborhood. Looking now at Aberdeen and Timisoara instead, we see that another common trait is this problem of deprivation in these neighborhoods. The population in this large neighborhood of Torri, where the social innovation was placed, is 10,000 people who live in comparably worse off economic situations compared with the rest of the city. Torri residents have 10,000 less of average income compared with Aberdeen at large. And there is a very large migrant community even there, with up to 18% of residents not speaking English as their first language. Timisoara instead is socially more homogeneous, but there is a problem of low thermal insulation even in relatively recent buildings created between the years 1960 and 1990. But in reality, there is a very large building stock of up to 60% of buildings which were built before 1940. So the situation is even worse for the majority of buildings which are really old and not efficiently insulated. So let's have a look at the social innovations, interventions that have been carried out in these neighborhoods. So in Timisoara, we had energy efficiency intervention in residential buildings and also municipal buildings to improve energy efficiency. We had also behavioral change interventions aimed at changing the habits and way that people were interacting with the buildings. And there was research ongoing on the issue of a specific problem of fuel poverty, finalizing at future interventions. In Aberdeen, we had instead the development of the heat network and associated energy efficiency improvement schemes. And similarly, I would say to other cases, behavioral change interventions. Stockholm and Malmo, again, similar type of interventions on energy efficiency. In Stockholm, we had on top of that some cycling and mobility measures to favor sustainable mobility within the neighborhood and towards the city of Stockholm. And in Malmo, we had on top of energy efficiency interventions and behavioral change interventions, we had also interventions on the water system to make it safe, to avoid flooding in the buildings, a problem that at that point was quite considerable. So looking at more specifically instead the barriers and drivers and how they affected the social innovations. In our project, we have identified a number of them, and I will go through the main of them and discuss a little bit how they were at play in these specific cases. Pro-environmental attitudes surely within the attitudinal factors group played a role, and they were a driver towards the initiation and the implementation of the social innovation, although with different degrees among stakeholders. Policymakers were more motivated by attitudinal actors, but not so much could be said by citizens, who instead saw maybe more of a personal gain and in what was driving them to participate in this social innovation. Of course, not all of them. Some of them were animated also by pro-environmental attitudes, but clearly many of them were quite interested in getting improvements to their dwellings, and this was something that motivated them to support the social innovation. Support, we will go into that later, was not a straightforward issue. At first, in some cases, we had problems, particularly in the case of Järva of Stockholm, but eventually most of people were on board. Pro-social attitudes were perhaps the main driver in terms of attitudes, particularly policymakers saw as an opportunity of the renovation of buildings and the other measures that were taken in the neighborhoods. As they saw in this an opportunity to somehow lift disadvantaged neighborhoods from condition of disadvantage, poverty. Of course, these interventions were not considered resolutive, but they were considered as something that could improve the neighborhoods, and this was certainly the leading attitudinal variable here. In terms of capabilities and resources, a key aspect which seems to be quite obvious obvious, but it is worth to be mentioned, is the fact that without appropriate financial resources, all these social innovations would have not taken off. Maybe this is not the case for other types of social innovations in other types of neighborhoods. Maybe social innovations that are based mostly on behavioral change, that might have a bottom-up initiative, can be different. But in this case, specific cases that we are considering, these were initiatives that were led from the municipalities mainly, and financial resources were important to support economically all the changes. Knowledge and skills were important as well, because without competencies in the municipalities would have not been possible to intercept government grant schemes, and would have been much more difficult to design and lead social innovations. Social status of the neighborhood was a problem. Marginalized and ethnic diverse community required more commitment, more engagement. At first, there were misunderstandings. Communication was not done properly in some cases. And so essentially, this was an important issue. Policy laws and regulations were very important to support the social innovations. Without those, again, the social innovations would have not taken off. And finally, media reports were an interesting magnifier of attitudinal drivers. So they initially instigated the social innovations because media reports were stigmatizing a problem of deprivation, and after they were boosting the support towards the social innovations because the positive changes were reported in the media. Okay, unfortunately, I've been told that I have just a minute left, so maybe I won't have the time to go in depth into the case of Järva. What I wanted to say that a number of interventions played in terms of distribution justice. They allowed people to have a better built environment to live in, bike facilities, a number of material improvements, which are clearly distributional justice issues. In terms of procedural justice, there was a dialogue that was developed after first lack of communication and inclusiveness, and this clearly created an environment where everyone was able to express their opinion and participating in co-designing the social innovation. This was very important. Recognition justice was expressed through targeted initiative towards particularly vulnerable subjects in the neighborhoods, like women and some cultural mediators were also employed to facilitate the participation of migrant communities. So there was clearly an attention to meeting the needs and enhancing the capabilities of the people in the neighborhood. So concluding about the social innovations that we have looked at, yes, they are, in my opinion, in our opinion, well placed to contribute to a just transition because they are multidimensional processes, so they can affect distributional issues, procedural issues, and act in terms of recognition justice towards vulnerable groups. They can be effective as long as there are financial resources and effective policies that are predisposed to promote the social innovations. They must be socially sensitive because top-down approaches don't work, and they create a backlash of individuals that might easily protest and be against any imposition or what they perceive as an imposition, to be more specific. So it is important to engineer the social innovations in order to harvest the attitudinal drivers, because the attitudinal drivers might be them pro-environmental attitudes or pro-social attitudes are probably there in the environment, but we need to create also the incentives and the benefits for people to get on board and avoid resisting the social innovations. If we do so, the social innovations can start to spread, and from being niches that can grow and contribute to changing the social technical landscape. Thank you.
Thank you, Giuseppe, for your discussion of the cases in Malmö and Stockholm, and also Aberdeen and Timmerswara to a certain extent. We make the jump into or back into the Malmö and Stockholm case again, but now with focus on how to model the social processes that go on. So please, David, take over for the next 15 minutes.
Hello. Leading on from Giuseppe's talk here, we're going to look here at the Stockholm-Malmö cases and how to start to translate those into an agent-based model. So if we could go to the next slide. So we start with a question, which is that good urban planning and regeneration requires participation of communities, of course. However, few people are predisposed to engage, and initiatives that may work well in one place may fail elsewhere. So the big question that is motivating the agent-based modelling in Stockholm and Malmö has been, how can regeneration initiatives that successfully involve communities, how can we do that? And how can those successful projects that worked in one place inform activities elsewhere? So you see, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to say, okay, there's been a huge amount of work in Stockholm and Malmö, and the case studies describe that. Giuseppe touched on it in the brief time that he had. But how can we take that knowledge, that valuable knowledge, where it's been successful, and actually at least provide it in some way that's reusable, potentially reusable, to help inform initiatives elsewhere? So what I'm going to do here is outline results from a phased process towards developing a tool, which is an agent-based computer model, to help address this question. Okay, I won't go over this. Giuseppe's covered it. We're based on case studies here in Stockholm and Malmö, and these describe successful social innovations related to neighbourhood participation. And this was something that is very important, as we say, that these successful activities in the case studies involved participation. They were successful in achieving that in challenging areas. So how did we do this? How do we go about this? And this is not as straightforward as it may seem. If there's one thing, one piece of knowledge I wish to communicate from this talk, it's that as an agent-based modeler, it's that translating this wealth of knowledge that's been generated in the case studies into a form that can be implemented as an agent-based computational model requires a serious amount of discussion and effort. There's no, to my knowledge, no simple step-by-step accepted process of doing this. So I just want to say this isn't a technical issue, although there are technical elements, but those come last. The hard part is getting ready, creating the knowledge in a certain way that you can start to implement this thing in an agent-based model. So the way we ended up doing this is we had iterative discussions involving, and we were fortunate enough as modelers and social researchers to have direct access to the case study practitioners who are involved in many of these successful activities, directly implemented them, both in the Stockholm municipality and in Malmö. So we had discussions with the practitioners, and as social researchers and modelers, we attempted to find common aspects that appeared to reflect the success of various activities in the projects. And this resulted in the first phase in a simple, easy to read, non-specialist 2-page model concept document. So one way that we structured these discussions, rather than having discussions that kind of didn't lead to an output, is we set ourselves a simple task, which is to produce a 2-page piece of text that all of the participants, the case study practitioners and the social researchers and modelers, could accept as a way forward, as something that a tool that could be useful, and also an evolving, larger, more technical model design, which is more orientated towards modelers. So ongoing work currently is the construction of an agent-based model. So what points emerged from this discussion? And I must say, I found this discussion process very interesting as a modeler. I found it, I learned a lot. So I would say that a lot of my initial sort of assumptions were not correct. So one point that emerged from this that I can state simply is that it seemed that successful initiatives comprised many individual smaller activities, that they were pieced together from many activities. So it wasn't the case that there was a big overarching plan that was applied to everybody in a region or a set of neighbourhoods that was pre-agreed and was applied. It was that there were sets of different activities that were overlapped, that worked at different rates. It's kind of an adaptive process. And the successful activities, and this was a major part that goes back to what Giuseppe emphasized, which is that it appears that the successful activities produce lasting social as well as environmental improvements. And we kind of converged around a kind of fairly unscientific concept, I guess, but I'll try to break it down here, which was that many of these successful activities made a noticeable improvement in what you might call neighbourhood spirit, or I think there was reference to the idea of people identifying with certain activities. So the idea that these, as Giuseppe said, many of these neighbourhoods are run down. This is why they need regeneration. They're socially challenged neighbourhoods. They're poor neighbourhoods. And this creates often a negative aspect to people outside the neighbourhoods, about those neighbourhoods, and the people living in those neighbourhoods. So the neighbourhood spirit is the idea of starting to improve that so that people actually feel better or proud even of where they live. So just briefly, I can't go into this in detail, what we did is we collected a set of activities, successful activities from both Stockholm and Malmö. We were trying to look at the common points from them. Here I list some of them. Each of these is a different activity, part of larger programs that apply to sometimes a single neighborhood of a few thousand people, sometimes to larger areas, multiple neighborhoods. So we collected these and we moved on then. If you go on to the next slide there, Christian, just to put the participation into context, we wanted to characterize for each of these activities, because participation is a major focus of this. We wanted to characterize for each of these activities some way of capturing this neighborhood spirit concept, this unscientific feeling that definitely practitioners use as a concept. So we looked into the literature a little bit as social researchers and found, here's one interesting piece of work that we drew on, which we believe, although the concept of neighbourhood spirit is not used directly in this work, but the more conventional ways of doing this in the social studies is to talk about things like social capital and neighbourhood attachment. And these have been studied quite thoroughly, and this particular paper referenced here is a survey-based paper with regression models. So what we did is we looked at what I've outlined there. We looked at each of these dimensions and said, okay, maybe neighbourhood spirit can be captured by characterizing different neighbourhoods along these dimensions, such as the trust, norms, social attachment, etc. Now, the important point about this diagram, which comes from this paper by Decker, is that traditional variables are often used to, in regressions on participation, look at the left-hand box. And these are, if you like, fairly fixed at a given time based upon the individual. These are fairly fixed variables, such as socioeconomic status, ethnicity, and other characteristics. Whereas the social capital, the neighbourhood spirit, are obviously more fluid. And that the important point is that participation itself, as well as being influenced by these more fluid these more fluid variables, if you like, the participation process feeds back into those, can improve them. So this is kind of common sense, right? If people actually start to participate with each other, both formally and informally, this increased trust, this increased social attachment. Okay. So what we did, and this is from the point of view of trying to elicit how these activities may have helped with neighbourhood spirit, is, we broke down this concept neighbourhood spirit into a set of qualitative dimensions based upon certain ideas in the literature, and I list some, well, the ones that we used here. Next slide, yes. So what we did is, for each activity, we created small templates that we elicited from the practitioners, where we asked, okay, could you characterize what actions each activity comprised briefly, what the preconditions were, and what the social outcomes you perceive to be as practitioners involved in this area? So these are qualitative categories, and all I've got there under social outcomes are the abbreviations related to the dimensions on the previous slide, and pluses, which indicate a qualitative increase. 2 pluses is more than 1 plus. Okay, these are not defining in any quantitative sense. They're just qualitative impressions of what happened. Okay, next slide. Just to give an example, here is a more detailed activity template, and this is really the size of those templates. An important point here was to not make large templates with many boxes to fill in, since this is a bane of everybody's life, but these are to be seen as kind of index cards that just describe an activity at some level and give the idea of some of the social outcomes. And you see there as well, you've got the SDG contributions that these activities, that the practitioners considered these activities contributed to. So the idea here is, given a set of these templates, each of these templates becomes, if you like, a high-level specification for an agent-based model. So the idea is, can we take these templates and can we translate them into an agent-based model? It's a big ask. Okay. So we have an ongoing ABM prototype, which is focusing on just a single activity. I mean, I'll be honest, my initial hope was that there would be enough commonality between these activities that maybe a single model could cover many, many activities. But actually, perhaps that's an overly ambitious idea. Each activity has its very specific points. So to start this process, we're focusing on one activity, which is the low energy retrofit of 70s housing in Stockholm, which the previous slide showed the detailed activity template. And the idea is to reproduce the case study outcome in an agent-based model, and then apply that model to new neighborhoods to gain an idea of what might happen there if we apply that activity. This is not prediction. This is more as an aid to a practitioner who wants to say, okay, what would happen if we tried this activity in this new neighborhood? Would we see the same kind of thing, or would we see something different that would make us think? So this is not like this agent-based model would tell us exactly what would happen, but rather it would help think about applying. Now, Andrea Scalco is currently working on that agent-based model, and he can answer detailed questions on this when we go to the discussion. But if we could briefly, since I now realize I only have 1 minute left, briefly we could go through the slides that Andrea has produced here that he could discuss in more detail if there are questions later. This is the Jager district, a map with buildings and points of interest. Next slide, please. And here we see some of the inputs to the model. Next slide, please. And here we see some of the way that the model would work, the main entities in the model. I think this is a stage slide, which I'm not ready for. So I don't know if you could complete the slide, Christina. Yes. So you see that we have households. We have houses themselves, apartments, we have households, people in them, and we have temperature, and the model takes account of all that. Okay, this is just a screenshot of the current model that Andrea has. It's too complicated to go into at the moment. As I say, Andrea will answer, he's available to answer those questions in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. And as you said, if you have questions, then please put them in the chat, and Andrea is also there to answer your questions, and maybe we can pick them up in the end when we have the discussions together. But I hand over to Wanda, who is now presenting also the development of an agent-based model on one part of one very specific point in time in the development of the Groningen case. Please, Wanda.
Yeah, warm welcome from Groningen. I would like to share some experiences with modeling a specific case. Click, please. The basic idea is how simple can a model be? And as an example, I like this painting of Pablo Picasso. When you're on the street in Spain and somebody is talking about a toro and you have no clue what a toro is, you could ask somebody to draw it. And Picasso very beautifully illustrates that it's an art of making it as simple as possible to capture the essence. It's not needed to have a Rembrandt kind of painting to explain what a toro is, what a bull is. And I think the same applies to modeling in this context, that you should try, despite the capability you have of making a model very realistic, but that the art is in making it as simple as possible to explain the core principles. But you should not go simpler than that, following the quote of Albert Einstein. Next slide, please. So we focus on the test case here. One of the cases, Groningen Holistic Transportation Policy, 50 years. It's on the top of the Netherlands. Click, please. And here we have the city itself. It's an old medieval compact town. Click, please. And in 50 years' time, we had transitioned towards a really the most ultimately cycling experience you can imagine. I mean, we're the best in the Netherlands, I would say, in cycling. Click, please. So the question is, having this case, what to model? Well, it's obviously that modeling 50 years of holistic transport policy, that's quite a complex challenge. And if you have such a storyline, it's not easy to transfer it to other cases. So it's not really that useful. So instead of that, we decided to focus on a very specific event that is relevant concerning the social dynamics that play a role, and as such is transferable to other cases of social innovation. Now we focus on an old case because in this project we want to have a proof of concept for the modeling. So we need to be capable of testing and comparing it against some historical case, against historical data. You can imagine that if the model really works, the concept really works, we can apply to new cases, and that will be easier because the data will be more available. Click, please. So we focus on a specific case where there was a road through a very beautiful old park. It was quite busy with cars, it was dangerous, and the people in the neighborhood were complaining about the traffic. So they decided to close it down as a test for a year so that people could get acquainted with a new situation. And during the closing time, they came up with the idea of having the first advising referendum in the Netherlands. So that became politically seen a very interesting thing. The referendum was very exciting. In the end, 50.9% of the people voted in favor of a permanent closure. And this really makes me also think about, for example, Brexit or the American elections. There are many situations that are very close call, and the social dynamics play a critical role for the development. Is it going this direction or that direction? Click, please. So here we see a picture of a landscape with a ball rolling through the time. And as you can see, there's a tipping point in 1994 where you can either go to a failure, you could say, where the park is open for cars, or to a success where the park is going to be car-free. And it's a very tipping kind of situation, and the social dynamics are very critical to understand which direction such a social system goes. Please click. So we focused on modeling these social dynamics at that time about the referendum on the park, and we have developed this simulation model where we capture the local population, we describe their needs, we implement the knowledge that we have, we model the interactions between the people, normative influences and informative influences, and we model the types of networks that emerge. Click, please. And to feed that model, of course, it's an historical case, so we coined the idea of behavioral archaeology. You know, we have to get the model running, we have to create an operational base, but we don't have all the pieces. For some pieces, we need just to fill it in, make assumptions to make ultimately a complete model work. And the data we used to complete this model were, for example, statistical yearbooks from that time, 25 years ago, old newspaper articles. There were scientific publications on the referendum that were very useful. We had some official reports from the events, and obviously we have maps from that time. So you can imagine that if you want to model a new case, that it will be much easier to collect data. Click, please. So what we found out that there were different people, and obviously these people had different interests. Some people were just enjoying the park, to have a nice time. There were children playing over there. Of course, there were people driving their cars through the park. And mind that 25 years ago, the car was very important as a token of your individual freedom. And because there was already quite a lot of anti-car policy in Groningen, a lot of inhabitants of the town were not too positive about, again, another policy against cars. And last but not least, there were a lot of people enjoying festivals being organized in the park. Click, please. What is also of interest is that the distribution of the people and their interest was different for different neighborhoods. If you were living close to the park, and that's the black area in the middle, as you can see next to the city center that is orange, most of the people were more involved with the park than the people that were living at a larger distance from the park. Click, please. So in the Groningen model, we have implemented a 1 in 10 scale the population. So we have 14,165 artificial agents composing 936 homogeneous groups of agents representing the population. And the representation of the people is based on age categories, that are 2 genders, 4 main economic activities. For example, student population was very large, and the different city districts, that were 12. Click, please. Now here we see the model, and Christian, if you can click on it so it starts to run, then we can see in green the neighborhoods that are in favor of closing the park for cars, and in red was a majority in favor of keeping it open. If you look in the details, which is a little bit difficult to see, but you can observe that there's in fact a majority of people in favor of keeping it open, but the people living in the vicinity of the park were more involved, so they had a higher tendency of casting their vote. So ultimately there was also in the model a small minority of a small majority of people voting for closing the park, whilst the whole population, there was a small majority in favor of closing it. So these dynamics can be captured with a model. Click, please. So the experimentation that we can conduct with this model is, first of all, exploring how sensitive a case is for these social dynamics. So we can find out the tipping point and how easy it is to tip from one outcome to another outcome, to a majority in favor of opening the park versus closing the park. Next, we can test all kinds of policies in this context, like informational campaigns, the endorsement of a certain position by opinion leaders, or we can even organize simulated neighborhood meetings and see how this impacts the social dynamics in this case. And finally, what is interesting is that we can involve communities in model experimentation, and that might help to reflect on their own future and their own agency in what we call bottom-up democracy processes. And in that sense, we hope that such models can contribute to processes of social innovation. So that's what I would like to share at this moment. And of course, I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Wanda, for this brief introduction into the very interesting model of the vote in Groningen. And at the moment, I can say you are testing different policy scenarios, and it's quite interesting, or we are all quite interested to see what comes out of these tests in the near future and how things could have been differently if small things would have been differently. We continue with our walk through the SMARTEES modeling achievements by now diving more into the model of Aberdeen and the questions connected to that. And I give the word to Gary.
Hello, everyone. I'm Gary Polhill, Senior Research Scientist at the James Hutton Institute. And I think that what I'm trying to do in this talk is maybe give you an idea of some of the decisions that need to go into what might be a very small part of the model of Aberdeen associated with how we might approach simulating people's trust in the advice they get for one-off decisions. You've heard about the SMARTEES project, so I propose not to give further background and motivation on that, except to point out that in Aberdeen, the key source of the social innovation is in the institutions that the council set up, offering on advice on heating and energy saving, and also on setting up the district heating network on a not-for-profit basis. When adopting new technology or unfamiliar technology, it needn't necessarily be new, because of course district heating's been around for a long time, you're making a one-shot decision which could have the potential to influence you for quite a long time. And so this, if you like, provides the basis for the thinking about a social dimension of the current obsession with techno-fix approaches to adapting to climate change, globally speaking. And the key issue is that individuals with no experience of a technology need to decide whether to adopt it, and that's a commitment with a potentially high cost of reversibility, especially in the case of heating. You've had some new infrastructure put in your house that requires investment and maintenance. In the particular case of heat network, you've lost some autonomy and independence because you are depending on a wider system to provide you with heat. I mean, you're doing that with gas and electricity, but in the case of a heat network, that's a different system that you're then depending on as well. From a societal perspective, of course, with respect to heat network, you have this issue that it needs to decide as a collective, the Aberdeen city, to invest in the infrastructure and maintenance needed to keep you, the individual, supplied with heat. Next slide, please. So the way we went about this was to draw on some fairly old algorithms from what's known as symbolic AI, which actually has its roots in what Maggie Bowden called computational psychology. So the AI, contemporary AI now, is sort of really just fancy statistics. And in the good old days, AI was much more about exploring ways of formalizing psychology. And one way of looking at agent-based modeling, if you're unfamiliar with it, is perhaps to see it as computational, social, and environmental psychology. So what we've done is we've drawn on this technique called case-based reasoning, which has actually been evidenced in the psychology literature that experts do make this decision in this way. It was used, for example, to simulate the way maybe a doctor might make a decision or something like that. But we can also see householders as experts in their own situation, their own living circumstances, and whether or not a technology might be appropriate for them. And it works on the basis of an episodic memory of experiences with actions. And so these are divided into a situation, what the context was in which an action was taken. So, for example, if we were talking about decisions over heating, let's say my previous heating system was very unreliable and I didn't like it, and I've decided I'm going to change it. The action would then be what you actually did, and that might be, let's say, just installed a new boiler but kept with the same essential technology and network. And then the outcomes of that, which could well be that, it worked fine and you were very happy and all you really needed was a new boiler. But it could equally be that you then became vulnerable to increasing fuel prices or something like this. And we then combine that with another AI algorithm called endorsements that provides a kind of, we call it qualitative, but of course numbers underpin it all. It's essentially an ordering of distinct classes of endorsement. And these are people, these classes of endorsement, as I hope I will explain shortly, are different kinds of relationship you have with people and organizations, and how much you trust them. So let's move on and talk about the case base. So because we're making a one-shot decision on something we might not have experienced, what we've needed to add to the case base is who told us about something. So, you know, if I'm going to explore, let's say, installing an air source heat pump or looking at joining a heat network, one thing I might do is seek advice from other people I know who have tried these systems. And this is where advice-giving bodies such as SCARF are so important, because, of course, they have a huge body of experience that is essentially on the basis of advising people and getting an idea of what the outcomes for them were. And so you might think, for example, that people would trust independent advice-giving bodies very highly. Equally, you might have had a friend who tried one of these systems and had an awful experience. And so you essentially, what we're doing here is creating a social case base that in the process of having conversations with various people about these different heating technologies, you build up your own kind of case base that's not your own experience, but an assemblage of the experiences others have had, keeping a record of who told you. And that's what makes this trust and endorsement kind of thing relevant. So if you move on to the next slide, just get a little bit more detail about that. The idea is that we have N classes of relationships. So that could be friends and family, for example, could be one class. Another class could be independent advice-giving bodies. Another one could be energy companies, because in the UK, and I think perhaps elsewhere in Europe, energy companies can also give you advice on how to save energy. And I think they're obliged to by law. And there could also be the mainstream media. So, you know, if you read a story about how wonderful someone's heat pump was in a newspaper, you know, that is another source of information. So you have these classes, those classes. I mentioned four there. There could be others. You then look through the cases involving a particular actions from agents in each class, and you use this formula on the right-hand side to compute the endorsement for that action. And I propose not to go into detail because, I mean, although if I explain it, I fully appreciate that, you know, equations take a long time to absorb. But the main point is that this parameter B essentially says, well, how many people in one class that is a sort of lower class of endorsement do I need to outweigh evidence in class in a higher class of endorsement? That's what B is all about. So if you look at that bottom bullet point, if B equals 3, then if impartial advice, which is trusted more highly, says an action will deliver, you know, will be really good, so we give a positive utility, then the next class down, let's say you entrust impartial advice more than advice from energy companies, they all need to say, 3 energy companies, if B equals 3, need to say that the utility is minus U, so exactly the opposite, in order to outweigh that advice. And what you do is you sort the actions by their endorsement and then choose the one with the highest endorsement. So if we move on. So obviously, one thing we're quite interested in is, well, how might we populate this with data from a quantitative survey? And this slide just sort of shows you the question that we asked of 10,000 residents of Aberdeen, which was split into 2,000 samples per quintile in an index of deprivation. It gives you an idea of how hard up people are, what their living circumstances are. And essentially the results of this was that actually it might seem surprising, household and family are far more highly trusted in general than any other of these people we asked about in the question. You know, the council, energy companies, the government and mainstream media. But it is notable that independent advice organisations such as SCARF, which is specifically named in the questionnaire, is sort of next down after household and family. So I think that's actually quite an interesting result, and in a way is vindication for the council this was a good thing to do. If you move on to the next slide. So essentially the use case, which is computational technology for this, is in an agent-based model of district heat network adoption. This is a map of Aberdeen, of Torry, sorry, a small area in Aberdeen that we're currently using to explore the dynamics of this. The model will also be applied in Timisoara, where they have a legacy heat network system, and there the problem is more significant because of the way that heat network system was institutionalized. There is mistrust by the population in that institution, and people are installing alternative technologies. So we need to think about ways that trust can change over time. But this is essentially the state of play, and we'll be able to explore switching the advice organisation on and off, for example, as one way of seeing how that affects the outcome, both in terms of fuel poverty and in terms of the level of adoption of the heat network. I think the next slide is just a summary of the talk. So one-shot decisions with significant financial or long-term implications using unfamiliar technology are difficult to make without information sharing among trusted sources. This is going to be critical for climate change mitigation and adaptation and the energy transition. No matter what technology all the geniuses come up with, in the end, people have to use it. And if they're not familiar with it and they don't have information they can base it on, that's going to be very difficult. And I think there's a lot we can bring in from some of the good old-fashioned AI rather than the sort of contemporary advanced statistics AI into agent-based models to simulate these kinds of policy scenarios. So that ends my talk, and I'm afraid I'm now going to have to leave the session because I have another meeting.
Okay, thank you, Gary, and we appreciate this introduction to the Aberdeen model and the central mechanism in this model, which is not only interesting for this very particular case, but for many other cases that both the European Union and its citizens have to deal with, and even the citizens that are no longer part of the European Union.
Yes. Thank you very much, Christian. And
yes.
Goodbye, everyone.
Yes, goodbye. Thank you, Gary. We end this series of talks from the SMARTEES project with a kind of a test balloon, an idea we have been discussing in the recent months in this project, namely how to communicate about these models. And the models are very complicated, and some of it is very technical. So we thought about alternative ways of getting this idea of simulation of social dynamics across to people. And we would like to share these ideas with you, which are still a work in progress. But Erika, please take over from here.
Yes, thank you, Christian. Christian is also part of this paper in construction, and Vander Jager and myself. I will start to say that social simulation as a tool for societal transition, explaining the methodology by means of improv theater dancers, is explorative, as Christian mentioned, and we will share some examples of how social simulations can be explained and understood by interaction with improvisation theater and dance, so that it can be used and understood as a tool for decision makers, policy makers, and other stakeholders. We believe that this holds a great potential for decision-making processes to enable the transition to the low-carbon society. So first, Vander will share some examples. I will follow up with some general remarks, and Christian may also come with some remarks. And we hope you will be intrigued by the possibilities of using out-of-the-box research communication to bridge the gap between decisions and research. So, Wander, you are on.
Yeah, thank you, Erika. Well, in the previews, we already heard about that people share information, but they also have normative influences on each other. And you can write extensively about it, and it's very important in understanding the social mechanisms that play a role in the spread of, for example, sustainable technology. And one of the famous graphs, and that's already a new way of trying to explain it, is this typical Rogers innovation diffusion graph, where you see in the light orange the typical S-curve, where in the beginning the diffusion goes quite slow, and then suddenly you have this kind of tipping point, and the diffusion is accelerating, and then ultimately the diffusion is completed. And the blue line also indicates that there are different types of people and different proportions of different types of people. In particular, the innovators is a small group that is daring to be deviant from the norm. And I think if you really want to feel, not only understand, but really feel this normative influence in innovation diffusion, we have to watch a very short, brief moment of the following movie. This one, yes. And here you see one crazy innovator dancing. And I think, Christian, you have to go a little bit further in the movie. There a little bit, there are some more people joining in. They're waving, hey, join in a little bit further. And yes, here's some people joining in. It takes a while. There are two more, yes. And then suddenly you see, wham, there's a transitioning happening. And now it's this kind of safe to join in. Basically, what you witnessed is a norm that is flipping over. We can go to the slides again.
Wait a second. Go back.
Okay.
Yes.
So here also the principle of social simulation models come in, because these kinds of processes can be simulated, such as tipping points, with social simulation models. And you can actually observe, for example, processes of exponential growth. And this is very important to communicate very clearly, because also with the pandemic, we observed that the concept of exponential growth is very difficult to grasp from just reading. So we are looking for creating a more experiential event where people experience these kinds of social dynamics. And social simulation models obviously are capable of demonstrating that. And if you can show the demonstration, Christian, and go, yes. And then we see on the left bottom, we see a few agents, and there's one spreading, and it's slowly spreading now. It's just like with the dancing. And now you can see it slowly moves. And suddenly you see that it's spreading faster through the network. We see also in the number of infected agents in the graph, we see that the curve is just like the innovation diffusion curve spreading up. We see here the S-curve basically growing as we witness the virus to spread through our artificial population. So this is already much stronger in giving an experiential picture of innovation diffusion than just writing about it. We can go back to the slides now. Next slide, please. So a simulation model is nice, but if you watch it, it's still passive. So we are keen in exploring more experiential forms. And that's where theater may come in. And what we're doing right now, we're experimenting with students is translating simple rules obtained from these very simple agent-based simulation models to exercises that can be performed with real groups of people. So you can take over now, Erika.
Thank you. Yes, so the need for explaining social simulation as a tool for societal transition, we think is obvious. And although different stakeholders may agree that radical, both structural and behavioral changes are necessary in order to enable this necessary transition, we do not necessarily share a common ground with regards to which policies should be used to stimulate these changes. So I would like you to continue actually a little bit, if you don't mind. Okay, so we want to demonstrate what a social simulation is able to capture, how and why it is a useful tool for policymakers to use these kind of approaches or communication strategies. So we explore which senses and experiences may be used to enhance the understanding of such complex social dynamics. And we think that this is a good approach because social dynamics grow from interactions between individuals, and therefore exercises involving groups of people that interact offers a platform to explore different types of interactions and the resulting group dynamics, as we said in the example earlier. Next slide, please. So why improvisation theater dancers? Well, we think it's also fun, so we want to entertain, of course. And using one SMARTEES study, we will demonstrate how improvisation theater dancers or just theater can serve as a basis for understanding and the use and potential of the social simulation model. In this case, we use HUMAT, but there are other models as well. And we use it in complex social, technical, energy transition processes, of course. So the aim of our approach here is to find new and exciting ways of explaining simulation models and the phenomena they illustrate in a comprehensive and engaging way. And we want to explore how rules in computer simulation and groups of agents can be translated into rules that define the interactions between a group of theatrical dancer, and hopefully also involving the participants and policymakers in this. So we also want to do interaction with the audience, so to say. So next slide. So this is our fairly new approach, and I would like to thank you for listening to us, and please let us know if you have any questions after this presentation. Maybe Christian wants to add something?
Well, we can take it in the general discussion.
Yeah.
So since that was the last presentation from the SMARTEES project that we prepared for today, I again would like to invite you to our final conference that we will have both online and offline, hopefully, in September. And well, I introduced it before, so I let this stand for a couple of minutes, but I would like to invite the speakers back to the stage that have been presenting today and that are still here. I also would like to invite you in the audience for sending questions if you have some. And Andrea, if you are available and would like to also join here in the discussion now, I would like to start the discussion by going back to the last presentation. And I think this is an issue that we meet both in this project and in other projects quite often, that we are asked, yeah, well, interesting models, but what do they say and how do they work and how can I understand what is going on here? So I think the idea of using a very different approach here by improv theater or dance is interesting to look at. But how would that look like in reality? So how would you translate an agent-based model, let's say the one from Groningen, into a dance, into an improvisation dance? So what is the element of the simulation model that you put into this dance situation?
Well, I don't know if you want us to answer, or but I think that it's very efficient to show how people interact and influence each other, and what becomes normal in this group of people when one starts to dance, and then maybe one joins after a while, and then suddenly everyone joins, and it becomes the norm in that setting to dance, basically. So that's what I find intriguing, and I think that social simulations can show this very well and illustrate it. So I think it's a great potential to bridge this gap between research and policy making, basically.
So the question put to Wander, how would you dance the decision about the park in Groningen?
Well, that's a challenge, of course, but the thing is, it's a binary outcome, right? So you have two groups that can be attractive, and the trick is to develop a kind of dance where people influence each other to go either to their group or to go to another group. So what you want to have is a kind of mechanism where clustering emerges and where contagion of ideas happens. And what you're currently doing with the students is thinking about, for example, having a network of people that are connected through strings of rope, and they can pull to each other, they can have an influence on each other, and in this way they can create kind of clusters of people that have more attraction to each other. So we're trying to work out these kinds of mechanisms in such a way, and we plan to play them outside in the field or something like that. But it's very exciting to start thinking about it. It's very funny because you start with an empirical thing, an empirical phenomenon, then you capture it in a simulation model, and the next the simulation model is being used to again make an exercise in the empirical field again. So it's a double translation, and well, you know, translations are difficult. We have to be very keen on keeping the essence of the whole exercise very clear, just as in the Picasso example showed.
Yes, thank you for these insights. I think now I have a clearer picture of how something like that could start. But for the next question, I would like to broaden it even a bit more, because what we see in the last couple of weeks and also before is that on the one hand, there is a lot of enthusiasm in groups of policymakers, but also energy modelers and so on about agent-based modeling, and there's a lot of expectation how these kinds of techniques could probably fill the missing link between the quantitative large system models on the one hand and the complexity of human behavior on the other hand. But from the discussions in the SMARTEES project, I also learned that modelers sometimes are quite skeptic about these expectations, agent-based modelers. So could you, the question going out to all the modelers in the talk now, could you give your impression on what agent-based models actually can contribute to both policy but also energy modeling decisions at the moment? And where are the limits of what the models can do?
I could say something there based on my experiences. I've thought about this quite a lot over the years. I've been involved in a number of projects that have promised things to policymakers. So you could put me on the skeptical side. However, I want to qualify all I'm going to say with two things. One, agent-based models is a big area. It's a bit like almost as big as saying model. It's not as big, but it's almost as big. So, of course, many different kinds of models. I could talk about the sort of models that I do and the projects I've been in. The danger here, and I think one of the reasons, and this is just my personal opinion, I don't have any great, take it for what it is. I think there's a danger that the reason why there's often enthusiasm from the policy side is because they do not understand what these models can and cannot do, and because they want a holy grail prediction machine, because it will save them time, money, and also it will allow them to offload responsibility. So, for example, we see this sometimes with experts, in quotes, that if you're making policy decisions and somebody promises you a model that will answer questions about what would happen if we made this choice or this choice, if the model tells you what you're happy with broadly, then you'll make that choice. And then then you can say, okay, we made this choice because the model supported it. And many agent-based modelers that I work with do not want to get into this trap. Therefore, it's why we try to emphasize that these models are not predictive models. There are predictive agent-based models, but the models I work with, they're not predictive models. The use value of such models, therefore, is more of challenging my belief is one of the major use values could be challenging the assumptions of policymakers by feeding back to them in a language they understand why certain policies may go wrong. So you say it's rather like, see it like playing a game. Really, see it like playing a game, even with a computer or not with a computer. You know, when people do business games, what you're looking for is scenarios that haven't been considered by the policymakers, that the system can throw up, and then the policymaker could say, well, I'm not going to consider that scenario. And then it's up to them to say why they wouldn't. If a model can produce it, why is it that is not something that you accept? So I think there are uses, but in general, my overall impression after these many years, 20 years of working with these models, is we need more humility in the modeling. We should try to avoid making blanket promises. You know, we will deliver a model that will solve your problems. And this is the danger. It's very easy to do because, in fact, that's what policy people like to hear. And dare I say, it's also what wins grants.
Yes.
If I may add to that, very often scientists are being asked to come up with predictions, and very often the metaphor of the crystal ball is being used. I think it would be good to consider agent-based models not as a crystal ball, but as a mirror that helps you to reflect on where you are and where you can go, developing scenarios and getting a better understanding of the dynamics you're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Are there more views on that?
I could say something just very brief about that. It matters also who this person who stands up dancing in the first place is, and if that person has a relation to other people around, and if so, if this relation is good or not. And so there are basically super spreaders in social innovation as well as in Corona, it seems. So we do have this individual characteristics that is included in social modeling that is not probably as present in other modeling approaches.
Yes. Then I would like to ask another question now, not to the models, but more to the social justice or energy justice part of the project. Giuseppe, from your perspective on social or energy justice, how can you make it successful in a local situation to address energy justice within the social innovation process? So what are critical steps here from your analysis?
Well, I mean, It's a it's a challenging question. I think that we have to bear in mind what are the constituents or the pillars of energy justice. So particularly distributional justice, procedural justice, and recognition justice. And so I think we have to ask ourselves, is the project of the social innovation that we are bringing forward going to contribute towards those goals? Is it making more just the distribution of goods and services in the urban environment that we are intervening on? Are we creating procedurally just processes that include people, that allow them to speak, that allow them to express their own concerns and wishes regarding the policies that we are going to put in place? Are we going to make sure that those socially disadvantaged groups that are often disregarded are instead included and their needs are taken care of? So I think that we need to develop a little bit of the habit, in my opinion, of analyzing the projects of social innovation through the lenses of energy justice, in order to make sure that the interventions that are designed follow those principles. And another issue that we need to make sure of is to be quite adamant as policy researchers and researchers about the fact that these projects need to be adequately funded. Otherwise, they will just rest on the willingness and the voluntary commitment of people, but they won't really change much. I think the reality of things in a social environment, urban social environment, where there are profound inequalities.
Yes, thank you. So to round it up now, after 3 hours of discussing SMARTEES, I would also like to invite the people that presented this morning into the next and last round here. And now I ask you a typical journalist question, and that is, could you give me, in 1 or 2 sentences, a finding from the research that you did in SMARTEES that really surprised you? So is there something where you stumbled across something new and surprising?
Oh yeah, we're currently playing around with a model, and we saw that if one of the less preferred options, if it's made more attractive, that people start to resist even more. And that was really fascinating, because it's so in contrast with what you basically would think from traditional optimizing modeling, right? But it shows that rejectance against something might be fueled in a society. If you make something more attractive, that people still think, no, we don't want it, we don't want it. And that this negative force is only being raised by making something more attractive. That was really an eye-opener.
Interesting. Anybody else with something?
Hello?
Yes.
Hello. I could say something. I'm having problems with my computer at the moment, so I might just cut out. There are a number of things that surprised me, because we had this iterative process, and I think just one was, and this is reflected in the case study literature as well, it comes through in many of the case studies, is how important. So I started out with a kind of idea, a prejudice, an agent-based modeler's prejudice, which was that there were all these agents moving around making decisions. But actually, I was surprised by how important particular actors were, individuals who were involved, the practitioners themselves, in fact, who were involved in the social innovation. So those individual practitioners are kind of like social entrepreneurs who pull everything together. And they are so important that it's kind of worrying, because you think, okay, things are becoming very dependent on the competencies and style of these individuals. And what I found was that the language of the technocratic language, if you like, that we often use, tends to even subconsciously downplay the role of individuals in these successes. And I think it would be a very interesting future project, maybe, to really focus on those individuals. Because when Gary was talking about saying we're using an AI system where we treat the residents as experts, which is a great idea, right, for making a decision. But from modeling social innovations, I began treating the practitioners as the experts. It's not for me as a modeler to decide how things work. You know, I need to understand how practitioners actually do what they do. And they're not always conscious of that, because in fact, this is going back to, as Gary said, the good old fashioned AI times, when there was an attempt to formalize doctors in expert systems. There used to be a job called knowledge engineering. And what that involved is sitting with expert consultants and over a long period of time, working out how they did things, because people don't operate in, you can't say to a person, tell me the rules you use. People don't use rules. They use feelings. They use connections. They'll say things like, well, when I go into a neighborhood, if you can make a contact with a certain person in a certain group and there's a rapport, you can. So there's a whole layers of social interaction that often get missed, because we sort of, I do this, we tend to sort of, although age-based modeling is about individuals, we sometimes lose, if you like, even the charismatic individual in this. So it's not something that we've tackled here directly, but I think it could be a very interesting future project to say, let's focus on these individuals who get things done. How do they do it? Now, of course, you have to have a lot of cooperation with those individuals, and those individuals are very busy people and maybe not so interested in sitting down for several months and trying to unpack how they do things. But that very much was a surprise to me.
Thank you for this insight. Is there one more person who likes to say something? If not, then we are 1 minute over time anyway. So I thank you all for presenting in this session. I thank the audience, especially the non-SMARTEES audience that followed us for the last 3 hours. This is the last session in the conference. There's now a lunch break, and then after lunch there's the closing session of the conference in the plenum. So have a nice lunch, everyone, and see you soon again.